Some photographs don't just capture a moment, they capture an entire era. On a rooftop in Marrakesh in January 1969, a woman stands barefoot, her silhouette framed against a hazy sky. She is Talitha Getty, otherworldly in her multicolored silks, while her husband, John Paul Getty Jr., seems merely an accessory to her effortless magnificence. Their image became the very definition of Bohemian royalty, a dream that captivated a generation. But the perfect photograph was a beautiful lie. It hid the story of a vibrant spirit who could not be contained by the gilded cage of the Getty name. Her tragic quest for freedom would end in death at age 30, forever becoming the bohemian bride the Gettys could never truly control. To understand Talitha, you must first understand that she was a creation of two colliding worlds, born on the edge of an empire in its final dying days. She was born Talitha Dina Pol on October 18, 1940 in Java, then part of the Dutch East Indies. It sounds impossibly exotic, and it was. Her father, Willem Jilts Pol, was a Dutch painter, and her mother, Poppet John, was the daughter of the celebrated Welsh painter Augustus John. Hers was a bloodline of art, bohemianism, and a disregard for convention. Her childhood should have been a sun-drenched idyll of creativity and tropical languor. But history had other plans. The world was at war. In 1942, the Japanese Empire invaded and occupied the Dutch East Indies. For a young European family, it was a cataclysm. Talitha's father was arrested and thrown into a Japanese prisoner of war camp, where for 3 harrowing years he endured starvation, disease, and brutal treatment that would leave a permanent scar on his body and soul. Little Talitha and her mother were not spared. They too were captured and spent the war in a separate Japanese internment camp for women and children. It was only after the war ended and the family was liberated that they could finally make their way to Britain, their private paradise torn apart by a global conflict. When the war ended and her father was finally liberated, he was a changed man, a ghost of his former self. The family was never truly whole again. Her parents' marriage dissolved, and Talitha was sent to a boarding school in London, a little girl carrying the unseen weight of war, displacement, and a broken home. This early experience of chaos and loss is crucial. It forged in her a deep-seated desire for security, but also a restless spirit, a constant search for a place to belong, for a beauty that could overwhelm the ugliness she had witnessed as a child. London in the late 1950s and early 1960s was a city on the cusp of a revolution. The gray post-war austerity was finally giving way to a riot of color, music, and social upheaval. It was the birth of swinging London, and for a young woman of uncommon beauty and artistic lineage, it was a world of intoxicating possibilities. Talitha enrolled in the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, the prestigious acting school known as RADA. She had a magnetic presence, though perhaps not the disciplined ambition of a truly great actress. Her talent lay not in inhabiting other characters, but in being herself. She was a face on the scene, a fixture in the trendy clubs and cafes of Chelsea. She landed a few minor film roles, appearing in productions like Village of Daughters and the Edgar Wallace Mystery Theater. She had a small part in the 1965 thriller Return from the Ashes, but her acting career never truly ignited. It was her life, not her craft, that was becoming her art. She was beautiful, charming, and possessed an innate sense of style that was years ahead of its time. She began to mix vintage pieces with haute couture, blending influences from the East with the sharp tailoring of the West. She was a walking, breathing collage of cultures, and people were mesmerized by her. Among those who fell under her spell was Rudolf Nureyev, the electrifying Soviet ballet dancer who had defected to the West. They had a passionate, if complex, affair. Nureyev was famously tempestuous and predominantly homosexual, but he was captivated by Talitha's exotic allure and fiery spirit. Their relationship was a whirlwind of artistic parties and intellectual fervor, but it was not destined to last. It was another chapter in her search, another intense connection that ultimately left her feeling unmoored. In 1964, she met a man who would change the course of her life forever. His name was Claus von Bülow, a Danish-born socialite and lawyer's assistant. He was older, sophisticated, and moved in the highest circles of European society. He was utterly besotted with Talitha, and for a time it seemed she had found the stability she craved. They became engaged, and she was introduced to his formidable employer, one of the richest and most feared men in the world, Jean-Paul Getty. The Getty Empire was a dynasty built on oil, ambition, and a ruthless, almost pathological frugality. The patriarch, J. Paul Getty Sr., was an enigma. He was an Anglophile who lived in a sprawling Tudor mansion, Sutton Place, in the English countryside, surrounded by priceless art. He had installed a payphone in his home for guests to use, and was infamous for haggling over every penny, even as his fortune swelled to billions. He was a man of contradictions, a great connoisseur of beauty, who showed little capacity for human affection, a father of 5 sons from 5 different marriages, most of whom he seemed to view with a mixture of disappointment and disdain. One of J. Paul Getty Sr.'s 5 sons was Eugene Paul Getty, who, in an early attempt to carve out an identity separate from his monolithic father, went by John Paul Getty Jr. Born in 1932, he was the 3rd son, a gentle, sensitive, and deeply introspective man who seemed constitutionally ill-suited to the brutal world of corporate oil that was his birthright. Where his father was ruthless, John Jr. was diffident. Where his father was driven by an insatiable hunger for profit, John Jr. harbored a quiet love for poetry, art, and classical music. He was a book collector, a cricket enthusiast, a man of quiet passions who had been relentlessly groomed to enter the family business. In the early 1960s, he had been dispatched to Rome to run Getty Oil's Italian division, Getty Oil Italiana. It was a position of immense responsibility, a crucial test from his father. On the surface, he was living the life of a privileged and powerful heir. He was married to his first wife, the athletic and capable Abigail Gale Harris, and by 1965, they had 4 young children. They lived in a fine home, moved in respectable circles, and John Jr. dutifully went to the office every day. But beneath this veneer of corporate success, he was suffocating. He loathed the oil business with a profound passion, viewing it as a soulless enterprise that was draining the life from him. He felt crushed by his father's impossible expectations and constant penny-pinching scrutiny. Every business decision was second-guessed, every expense report audited from the patriarch's seat of power in Sutton Place. He was living in a state of perpetual anxiety, desperate for a world of beauty, music, and authentic culture that felt a universe away from balance sheets and drilling rights. He was a prince in a tower, dreaming of escape. In 1965, at a dinner party in Rome, hosted by the up-and-coming fashion designer Diane von Furstenberg, the world of John Paul Getty Jr. collided with the world of Talitha Pohl. The attraction was not just instantaneous, it was seismic. It was a recognition. In Talitha, John saw not just a beautiful woman, but the very personification of the Bohemian freedom he craved. She was art, rebellion, and exotic beauty made flesh. She was his passport out of the gray, regimented world his father had built for him. And in John, Talitha saw more than just an impossibly wealthy heir. She recognized a fellow spirit, a sensitive, artistic soul trapped behind a facade. He was gentle and shy, the antithesis of the aggressive, predatory men who often moved in her circle. He represented a gateway to a world of unimaginable wealth and the security she had lacked since childhood. But he was also a kindred spirit who understood her restlessness. He was a man she could potentially save, and who in turn could provide her with the ultimate sanctuary. The fact that he was married with 4 children and she was engaged to his father's own trusted employee seemed trivial in the face of such a powerful connection. Their affair began with a passionate, reckless abandon that scandalized the discreet, gossipy world of high society. This was not a quiet indiscretion, it was a detonation. John Paul Jr. quickly and decisively left his wife and children, a move that sent shockwaves through the Getty dynasty. Gail, his estranged wife, was left to raise their 4 children, including the infant John Paul Getty III, alone. Simultaneously, Talitha broke off her engagement to Klaus von Bülow. This act infuriated J. Paul Getty Sr. on a level that was both personal and professional. He saw it as a profound and calculated betrayal. In his rigid corporate view of the world, his son had abandoned his post and his responsibilities. And this young actress, this flighty bohemian, had publicly humiliated his loyal assistant. The old man, predisposed to suspicion and disdain for outsiders, developed an immediate and lasting contempt for Talitha. He saw her as a gold digger of the highest order, a frivolous, dangerous influence who represented everything he despised: artistic indulgence, emotional impulsivity, and a disregard for duty. He could not have known that this woman he so disdained was not just a passing fancy for his son, but the woman who would soon become his daughter-in-law, forever linking her name to his own. On December 10th, 1966, John Paul Getty Jr. and Talitha Pohl were married in a civil ceremony at Rome's City Hall. The event was a quiet affair, but every detail was a statement. The groom wore an unconventional but stylish corduroy suit. The bride, in a move that would be endlessly copied and referenced for decades to come, eschewed a traditional white gown for a chic, thigh-skimming white mini dress. Over it, she wore a dramatic, mink-lined hooded white cape. It was a look that was simultaneously innocent and regal, modern and timeless. It was a declaration of intent. She was not going to be a conventional Getty bride, subsumed into the staid corporate identity of the family. She was going to be herself. The wedding was most notable, however, for who wasn't there. The groom's father, J. Paul Getty Sr., refused to attend. It was a brutal and very public snub, a clear message to his son and to the world that he did not approve of the union and considered Talitha an unwelcome interloper. From the very beginning, a dark cloud of patriarchal disapproval hung over their marriage. This was not merely a case of hurt feelings, it was a strategic reality. The old man held the purse strings to their entire existence, and his disapproval meant that their life, no matter how luxurious, would always be lived on his terms, under the constant threat of being financially cut off. Initially, however, their life together was a fairy tale played out on the world stage. John Paul Jr., finally liberated from the oil business he loathed, threw himself headlong into the counterculture with Talitha as his guide. They were young, beautiful, and fantastically wealthy, and they were absorbed into the highest echelons of the swinging 60s scene. Their circle of friends was a veritable who's who of the era's creative elite. They partied with the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the doomed ethereal Brian Jones, who became a particularly close friend. They spent time with the Beatles, hung out with the visionary fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent, and were friends with the filmmaker Roman Polanski and his wife, Sharon Tate. They were impossibly glamorous, shuttling between apartments in London and Rome, living a life that seemed to be a perfect fusion of aristocratic privilege and rock and roll rebellion. But they craved a world of their own, a sanctuary far from the prying eyes of the press and the long, disapproving shadow of John's father. Beginning in late 1966, after their wedding, they found their sanctuary in Marrakesh, Morocco. At that time, Marrakesh was a city shimmering with mystique, a magnet for the international jet set, itinerant hippies, artists, and anyone seeking to shed the constraints of Western society. It was a place of sensory overload, the vibrant colors of the souks, the scent of spices and incense, the hypnotic sound of Nawa music, and, crucially, a place of profound permissiveness. Hashish was plentiful and part of the culture, and harder substances were beginning to flow through this libertine paradise. Here, in the heart of the ancient Medina, they bought a riad, a traditional Moroccan palace. It was called the Palais de la Zahia, the Palace of the Brilliant One. For centuries, it had been a home for nobles and courtesans, a sprawling labyrinthine complex of courtyards, trickling fountains, and rooms lined with intricate tilework known as zellige. When they bought it, it was beautiful but crumbling, a faded jewel in need of a new life. Over the next 2 years, they poured their time, their creative energy, and a great deal of Getty money into transforming it. This was not a simple renovation. It was an act of artistic creation, a collaboration of singular talents. They enlisted the help of brilliant collaborators, including the American-born designer Bill Willis and the legendary French decorator Madeleine Casting. But the vision was purely their own. They orchestrated a masterful fusion of traditional Moroccan craftsmanship with psychedelic patterns and opulent European furniture. They commissioned local artisans to restore the ancient tilework and carve intricate plaster details, while simultaneously covering walls and ceilings with bold, hallucinatory patterns. They filled the rooms with mountains of velvet and silk cushions, ornate brass lanterns that cast a dappled, dreamy light, and priceless carpets laid over cool marble floors. The heavy, sweet scent of incense, hashish, and blooming jasmine permeated every corner. The Palais de la Zaya became more than a home. It became their personal kingdom, a fantasy world built to keep the harsh realities of the outside world at bay. It was a physical manifestation of the Bohemian dream, a pleasure palace dedicated to beauty, art, and unrestrained indulgence. And indulge they did. Their palace became the undisputed epicenter of the hedonistic Marrakesh scene. Their parties were the stuff of legend, drawing the likes of Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull, who would stay for weeks at a time, along with the great couturiers of Paris and visiting rock royalty. Guests would lounge on piles of silk cushions, listening to the latest records from London and Los Angeles, mixed with live Moroccan folk music, enveloped in a thick, sweet haze of cannabis smoke. It was an environment of total freedom, where the lines between night and day blurred, and the pursuit of pleasure was the only rule. In August 1968, the fantasy seemed to become even more complete. Talitha gave birth to their only child, a son. In a typically eccentric and anti-establishment flourish, they named him Terra Gabriel Galaxy Gramophone Getty. The birth of his son seemed, for a brief time, to ground John Paul Jr. He adored the child. But the profound mundane responsibilities of fatherhood began to clash with the escapist, chemically fueled lifestyle he and Talitha had so carefully constructed. A baby's cries and feeding schedules were a harsh dose of reality in a world designed to transcend it. The perfect fantasy was beginning to show its cracks. The problem with building a world based on pleasure and escape is that reality and the darker parts of human nature eventually find a way to break in. For John Paul Jr., the immense pressure of being a Getty, even a rebellious one, never truly went away. His financial existence was entirely dependent on the family trust, which was controlled by his ever-disapproving father. He was haunted by a deep sense of purposelessness, a feeling that he had rejected his father's world, but had failed to create anything of substance to replace it. He was a patron, not a creator, and this gnawed at him. He began to retreat further into himself and further into the chemical comforts that Marrakesh offered in abundance. While cannabis and hallucinogens were part of the social fabric of their circle, a far more sinister substance began to permeate their world: heroin. For a man like John, plagued by anxiety and self-doubt, the drug offered a seductive and terrifying promise: the complete obliteration of psychic pain. It started as a recreational indulgence, another thrill in a life filled with them. But for John Paul Jr., it quickly spiraled into a deep and devastating addiction. And Talitha, who had been a partner in all his adventures, a co-creator of their shared world, was pulled into the vortex with him. It is difficult to pinpoint exactly when or why her own drug use tipped from casual experimentation to something more compulsive. Some friends would later insist she only dabbled, trying to keep pace with her husband. Others believed she became dependent on the drug as a desperate way to connect with him, to enter his increasingly remote world, even as that world was shrinking and darkening. Their shared habit became a toxic, codependent bond, isolating them from the outside world and, paradoxically, from each other. The beautiful, vibrant life they had built in the Palais de la Zaya, their fortress of beauty, began to rot from the inside. The dream was beginning to curdle. That iconic photograph taken by Patrick Litchfield in January 1969, the one that captured them on their rooftop against the Atlas Mountains, represented the myth of their Bohemian royalty at its absolute apex. The reality, however, was that the rooftop was not a summit, but a precarious perch, and they were already beginning a long, slow fall. The very paradise they had constructed in the Palais de la Zaya, designed as a fortress against the outside world, began to morph into a beautiful claustrophobic prison. The serpent in their Eden, the heroin that had started as another exotic indulgence, was now coiling itself around the foundations of their life, poisoning everything from within. The legendary parties, once vibrant gatherings of the world's most creative and beautiful people, began to dwindle. Those that did happen took on a more desperate, haunted quality. The guest list shifted from rock royalty to a more insular, shadowy cast of fellow users and sycophants. The sweet haze of cannabis smoke was replaced by the acrid, funereal scent of opium and the grim rituals of the needle. The palace, once a testament to their shared creative vision, became a monument to their shared disease. Friends who visited them in Marrakesh during 1970 were shocked and horrified by what they found. The vibrant, magical home felt derelict and haunted, thick with an atmosphere of paranoia and despair. John Paul Jr. was disappearing. The gentle, bookish man who had charmed Talitha was being systematically erased by his addiction. He became a near-total recluse, his addiction consuming him entirely. He would spend weeks locked away in his rooms, refusing to see anyone, including his wife and his young son. His days dissolved into a monotonous cycle of scoring, preparing, and using the drug, a state of living death that obliterated time, ambition, and love. His physical health deteriorated alarmingly. He became a wraith, thin and disheveled, a ghost haunting the corridors of his own palace. For Talitha, this was a waking nightmare. She was trapped in the most exquisite of cages. She was married to one of the richest heirs in the world, living in a home celebrated for its beauty. Yet she was profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The partner with whom she had built this world was now a stranger, lost in a narcotic fog from which she could not retrieve him. Her primary role shifted from creative muse and society hostess to that of a desperate caretaker, trying to manage the unmanageable disease that had hijacked her husband's soul. More pressingly, she was a mother to a young child. The challenge of raising Tara in a house where heroin was a constant, malevolent presence was an unbearable burden. The Bohemian freedom they had sought had curdled into a dangerous and toxic domestic chaos. The freedom to be oneself had led to a state of total neglect. She loved her husband, but he was vanishing before her very eyes, and she feared that she and her son would be pulled into the abyss with him. By the latter half of 1970, the situation had become utterly untenable. The Moroccan fantasy was over. In an act of profound courage and desperation, Talitha knew they had to escape. She managed to break through her husband's drug-induced apathy and convince him to leave Marrakesh, to return to Europe and seek treatment for his addiction. They moved to London, hoping that a change of scenery, away from the ready supply and decadent atmosphere of Marrakesh, and with access to the best medical help money could buy, could save him, and in turn, their marriage. But addiction is not a place. It is a state of being. The move to London did little to help. The city itself was awash with drugs, and John's habit, detached from the Moroccan sun, simply continued in the gray London gloom. Their relationship, already strained to the breaking point, grew even more toxic. The dynamic of addict and caretaker became entrenched, filled with broken promises, recriminations, and despair. Talitha began the slow, agonizing process of accepting a devastating truth. She could not save him. To save herself and, more importantly, her son, she would have to leave. In the early months of 1971, she made the most painful decision of her life. She separated from her husband. She took young Tara and moved into an apartment of her own in London's Chelsea. This period is often overlooked in the telling of her story, a brief interlude between the glamour of Marrakesh and the tragedy of Rome. But it is perhaps the most revealing chapter of her life. For the first time in years, Talitha was on her own, a single mother attempting to build a life out of the wreckage of her marriage. It was an act of immense strength. She began to actively focus on her health, trying to cleanse her body and mind from the destructive years. She practiced yoga and focused on nutrition, attempting to live a clean life, free from the influence of hard drugs. Her primary focus became creating a stable, safe, and loving environment for her son, something that had been impossible in the chaos of the last few years. She was attempting to break free from the toxic codependency that had defined her marriage and reclaim her own identity, not as Mrs. Getty, the Bohemian style icon, but simply as Talitha, a woman and a mother. Friends from that time recalled seeing a new determination in her. The ethereal, almost otherworldly beauty was still there, but it was now grounded by a quiet strength. The frantic energy of the 60s had been replaced by a more sober and reflective mood. She spoke of the future, of perhaps restarting her acting career on her own terms, of finding a new purpose. It seemed, for a brief, hopeful moment, that she might actually escape. She was taking the difficult, painful steps to build a life for herself, separate from the glamour, the wealth, and the poison of the Getty world. She was fighting for her survival. But the pull of the past and of the man she still loved remained immensely powerful. John Paul Jr., left to his own devices in London, was lost. Without Talitha's presence, he spiraled even deeper into his addiction and isolation. From this desperate place, he began to make gestures towards recovery. He promised he was changing, that he would finally get clean. He begged her for a reconciliation, pleading that he could not live without her and their son. For Talitha, this was an impossible dilemma. Despite the pain and the betrayal, she still held out hope. She wanted to believe they could rebuild their life together, that the profound love that had once burned so brightly could be rekindled from the ashes of their addiction. She wanted her son to have a father. After months of separation, she agreed to a tentative step. In the early summer of 1971, they decided to try again. Talitha agreed to meet John in Rome, where he kept an apartment in a grand building on the Piazza d'Araqueli, in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill. The plan was to spend time together, to talk honestly about the future, to see if their family could be made whole again. Talitha traveled to Italy full of a fragile, guarded optimism. She was not naive about the challenges they faced. Before she left London, she reportedly told a friend, "I'm going to see if there's any chance of us getting back together, but I don't want to get back on the needle." It was a clear, emphatic statement of her intent. She was returning to her husband, but she was not returning to the life they had left behind. She was drawing a line in the sand. On the morning of July 11th, 1971, Talitha Getty arrived in Rome. The details of what happened in the next few hours are murky, a confusing mosaic pieced together from contradictory police reports, the unreliable testimony of a few witnesses, and the fog of John's own drug-addled memory. What is known is that she and John were together in the apartment. The reconciliation was immediately complicated by the presence of a third person in the apartment. John's mistress, a young actress and model named Victoria Brooke. Her very presence suggests that the reunion was not the intimate, focused effort Talitha had hoped for. It speaks to the chaotic and morally ambiguous world John now inhabited, a web of love, jealousy, and shared addiction that was impossible to untangle. For Talitha, arriving in Rome to find her husband's lover already installed in the apartment must have been a devastating blow, a clear sign that his promises of change were perhaps hollow. The fairy tale came to its final brutal end almost as soon as it had begun. That same morning, July 11th, Talitha Getty was found dead in the apartment. She was lying on a bed, the frantic reunion having lasted only a matter of hours. She was just 30 years old. The cause of death was immediately a subject of intense speculation and media frenzy. An autopsy was performed by the Italian authorities, and the results were devastatingly clear, if not entirely surprising. Her body contained a lethal combination of alcohol and heroin. The official story, the one that was swiftly cemented in the record books, was that her death was a tragic accident. The neat, plausible narrative was that Talitha, despite her best intentions, had suffered a fatal relapse. In a moment of weakness, emotional turmoil, or despair following her arrival in Rome, she had used heroin again after a significant period of abstinence. Her body's tolerance for the opiate would have been dramatically lowered, making a dose that was once normal for her suddenly, catastrophically fatal. It was a tragic but sadly common story of addiction, a cautionary tale that the press eagerly reported. But for those who knew her, for those who had witnessed her courageous fight to build a new, clean life in London, this explanation felt too simple, too convenient. It raised a host of uncomfortable questions that have lingered for decades, refusing to be silenced. Did she really, truly choose to use heroin again, knowing the risks, knowing that it was the very substance that had destroyed her marriage and nearly her life? Or was she pressured into it, emotionally or physically, in that fraught, claustrophobic apartment? Was it a shared, final, twisted ritual with the husband she was trying to simultaneously leave and reclaim? And then there was the darkest possibility of all: suicide. Was it possible that the reunion in Rome had been an immediate and unmitigated disaster? That she had taken one look at John, perhaps still using, still entangled with another woman, and realized in a single soul-crushing moment that her hopes for a future together were a complete illusion? In a state of absolute despair, faced with the death of her last hope, did she decide that an escape into the oblivion of death was the only escape left to her? We will never know for sure. The only other people in the apartment, John Paul Jr. and his mistress, Victoria Brooke, provided accounts that were confused, self-serving, and contradictory. John himself was so deep in his own addiction, so profoundly traumatized by the event, that his memory of that fateful night was forever clouded, unreliable, and incomplete. The truth died with Talitha. While the truth of Talitha's final moments would forever be shrouded in speculation and the conflicting, unreliable accounts of those present, the consequences of her death were immediate, brutal, and starkly clear. The focus of the story abruptly shifted from the private tragedy inside a Rome apartment to the public stage, where the Getty Empire would perform its final ruthless act in the life of its most troublesome daughter-in-law. For a dynasty built on the control of narratives as much as the control of oil, the sudden death of Talitha Getty was not a moment for grief. It was a crisis to be managed, a scandal to be contained, and a story to be rewritten. The death of a 30-year-old woman, a celebrated beauty married to one of the world's richest heirs, in a Grand Rome apartment under mysterious circumstances involving heroin, was a perfect storm for a media sensation. But the Getty family, led by its cold and formidable patriarch, was not an ordinary family. It was a global corporation, and its primary instinct in the face of any crisis was not to grieve, but to manage. The aftermath of Talitha's death was as tragic and chilling as the death itself, a masterclass in ruthless damage control. From his Tudor mansion in England, J. Paul Getty Sr.'s reaction was immediate, decisive, and utterly devoid of compassion. His first and overriding concern was not for his grieving, drug-addicted son, nor for his now motherless 3-year-old grandson, Tara. His primary fear was that John Paul Jr. would be implicated in Talitha's death, potentially facing charges of manslaughter or drug distribution under Italian law. The prospect of a Getty heir being embroiled in a criminal investigation with the family's name dragged through the mud of a sordid public trial was an existential threat to the dynasty he had built. He dispatched a team of high-powered lawyers and fixers to Rome with a clear mandate: control the narrative, ensure the official cause of death remained accidental, and extricate his son from Italy as quickly and quietly as possible. The Getty machine went to work, navigating the Italian legal system and managing the press with brutal efficiency. While a formal investigation was open, John Paul Jr., the key witness, was deemed too unwell and incoherent to provide a reliable statement. He was soon permitted to leave the country, effectively ending any serious inquiry into the precise circumstances of his wife's death. The official story held: Talitha's death was a personal tragedy, an accident, a cautionary tale, not a potential crime. In a display of his legendary and almost surreal stinginess, the old man even complained bitterly about the costs associated with his daughter-in-law's death and funeral arrangements. In his mind, Talitha, the woman he had always despised, was proving to be a final posthumous inconvenience and expense. He showed no flicker of sorrow, only a ruthless desire to cauterize a public relations wound. For him, her death was not a family tragedy. It was a line item on a balance sheet, a problem to be solved with money and influence. He had never accepted her into his family in life, and he was determined to erase her disruptive influence in death. For John Paul Getty Jr., the death of his wife was the cataclysm that finally shattered his already fragile psyche. It plunged him into a profound, bottomless depression that would last for more than a decade. The shock and grief layered on top of his severe addiction were an unbearable weight. He fled Rome and retreated to London, where he became a complete recluse, locking himself away from the world, consumed by heroin and sorrow. He was, in the words of one biographer, a professional junkie, kept alive only by the immense fortune that allowed him to fund his habit without the usual consequences of poverty or imprisonment. He was a ghost, haunted by the memory of the woman he loved and his own unknowable role in her death. He barely saw his children. His youngest son, Tara, the child he had with Talitha, was effectively orphaned. In one fell swoop, he had lost his mother to death and his father to the living death of addiction. The responsibility for his care fell to John's first wife, Gail Harris, who in an act of remarkable grace took Tara in and raised him alongside her own 4 children. Tara grew up in the shadow of a mother he could not remember, a mythologized figure in an iconic photograph, and a father who was a famous, absent specter. For over a decade, John Paul Jr. existed in this state of suspended animation. His life was a grim testament to the destructive power of both heroin and inherited wealth, a combination that allowed him to remain cocooned in his grief and addiction. It was only in the mid-1980s, after a long and arduous process of intensive treatment and therapy, that he finally managed to achieve a fragile sobriety and begin the slow process of re-engaging with the world. He would go on to stage one of the most remarkable third acts in modern public life. He emerged from his lost decade as a quiet, serious, and profoundly generous philanthropist, perhaps seeking to atone for his lost years or to build a legacy of beauty to counteract the ugliness of his past. He began to give away his fortune. He became one of the greatest benefactors to the arts and cultural institutions in Britain, the country he had adopted as his home. He donated hundreds of millions of pounds to organizations like the National Gallery, the British Film Institute, and the Imperial War Museum. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for his immense charitable work, becoming Sir Paul Getty. In his later years, he was a quiet, dignified, and respected figure who rarely, if ever, spoke of his past. But friends noted that the ghost of Talitha and the tragic, beautiful years they shared never truly left him. When he died in 2003, his life was celebrated as a story of redemption, of a man who had pulled himself back from the very brink. But what of Talitha's legacy? For many, she remains frozen in time, forever the beautiful, enigmatic woman on the rooftop in Marrakesh. Her most visible and enduring legacy is as a style icon. She has become a perennial muse for fashion designers, the eternal godmother of the look that would be variously dubbed Bohemian chic, hippie deluxe, or gypset. The aesthetic she pioneered, a luxurious, globe-trotting, and culturally fluid blend of ethnic garments, haute couture, and antique treasures, has been endlessly recycled and reinterpreted on runways from Paris to New York. Every time a designer sends a model down the catwalk in a flowing caftan, an embroidered tunic, wide-legged silk trousers, or chunky silver jewelry, they are, knowingly or not, channeling the spirit of Talitha Getty. She curated a style that was not just about clothes, but about a life, a fantasy of exotic travel, artistic freedom, and effortless glamour that still holds a powerful, aspirational allure. Beyond fashion, she has become a symbol of the 1960s, but a complicated and cautionary one. She represents both the incandescent promise of the era, its explosion of creativity, its rejection of conformity, its search for new ways of living, and its dark, self-destructive underbelly. Her story serves as a stark reminder that the quest for ultimate freedom can sometimes lead to the ultimate prison. She is a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess, a tragic illustration that beauty, wealth, and fame are no protection against profound human suffering and the insidious disease of addiction. Perhaps her most important and most tragic legacy is a human one. It lies in her son Tara, who grew up navigating the complex inheritance of his mother's mythic image and his father's long and troubled absence. He eschewed the public, glamorous, and ultimately destructive world his parents had inhabited. He chose a life far from the public eye, becoming an ecologist and conservationist in Africa. He has dedicated his life to preserving the natural world, a world far removed from the artificial paradises and pleasure palaces his parents had tried to build. His life's work feels like a quiet, poignant, and powerful response to the chaos of his childhood, an attempt to cultivate and protect something real, enduring, and tangible. So when we look at that famous photograph today, we see it with different, sadder, and wiser eyes. We can still admire the beauty, the style, the perfect composition, and the effortless glamour, but we can also see the fragility. We can see two young, beautiful, and damaged people playing roles, projecting an image of perfection that they themselves could not sustain. We understand that the rooftop in Marrakesh was not a summit of freedom, but a precarious stage, and that the new nonconformists were, in fact, trapped by forces they couldn't control, the weight of a dynastic name, the corrosive power of addiction, and a desperate, codependent love. Talitha Getty's life was not a simple tragedy of a poor little rich girl who took too many drugs. It was the far more complex and heartbreaking story of a woman who spent her entire life searching for a home. She was a child of war and a crumbling empire, a refugee from a lost world who sought to build a new one out of beauty, art, love, and a rebellious spirit. And for a moment, she almost succeeded. For a brief shining period on that rooftop in a fantasy palace of her own creation, she seemed to have it all. But the world she built was as fragile as it was beautiful, constructed on a foundation of inherited money and escapist drugs that ultimately proved to be quicksand. In the end, she was undone by the very things that seemed to define her freedom, by the immense controlling power of the Getty fortune, by the destructive allure of addiction, and by her profound love for a man who was as lost as she was. She was the Bohemian bride who captivated the world, but whom the Getty dynasty could neither understand nor tame nor ultimately save. Her death at 30 was not just the end of a life, it was the symbolic end of an illusion, a beautiful, dangerous dream of the 60s from which the world was about to have a very rude awakening. Her story lingers, a haunting and unforgettable reminder that behind every perfect image there is a complex and often painful human